Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Well, it's obvious today that we're still unable to broadcast from our beautiful studios in Beasley Media Center, but App TV is still dedicated to providing quality programming. So fortunately, we're able to record this interview from Studio East, which is my basement. And our guest today is also joining us remotely, Dave Robertson. Thank you, Dave, for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Ozzie.
Yeah.
Come on.
I want to get right to Dave in a moment, but I want to introduce today's topic. Human beings, we all know, have a propensity to be religious or to be spiritual, and the variety of religious experience across the globe is astounding. And I've often wondered why some people have a propensity to be religious, and among those who are religious, why they have a propensity to be religious in a particular sort of way. And our guest, Dave Robertson, is an expert in human behavior, particularly as it respects personality types. And he has some fascinating information to provide us about how human personality tends to affect, if not determine, the way we are religious, or even whether or not we tend to be religious. I hope that wasn't too much of an oversimplification, Dave, but I really appreciate you joining us today and being willing to join us remotely.
Thanks a lot for having me, Ozzie. I'm really honored to be here.
Yeah. I'd like for our viewers to know a little bit about you. I'll let you introduce kind of what you've been doing in Boone for the past 30 years, but you have recently retired as Director of Student Programming and the Plymouth Student Union. Is that correct?
That's right. I came to Appalachian in 1985 after 11 years in higher ed at other places prior to coming here, and served in those capacities at Appalachian. People that might not be familiar with me, but may be familiar with the student union, I had a hand in the design and construction of every aspect of that building after the original building that was opened in 1967.
And it is a beautiful facility. Speaking as someone who's been here even longer than you, I've been able to witness that transformation, and it has made a tremendous improvement on our campus. So we're grateful to the influence you had in that design over the years. So let me ask this, Dave. How did you come to focus some research and interest in human personality, and maybe talk a little bit about the particular focus of your expertise, which is Myers-Briggs testing of human personality?
Well, Ozzie, the story goes back to prior to me coming to Appalachian when I was a young assistant dean of students at Radford University in Virginia. I came to work for a wonderful woman who was very talented and is a legend at Radford, actually. Her name was Bonnie Hurlbert, and she was the dean of students. And I was hired, in my perception, to bring some new ideas and a breath of fresh air into the dean of students operation at Radford. And unbeknownst to me, was met with roadblocks at every turn with every idea and suggestion that I made. And at the end of our first year of my employment there, we were introduced to the Myers-Briggs type indicator and Jungian psychological types by a consultant who did a staff development workshop. And I noticed in the big type chart that he put up with all the staff and student development at that university, I noticed that I was an ENFP and that Bonnie, my boss, was an ISTJ, total opposites. And I had an aha moment that day. And I persuaded her to let me get trained at the Centers for Applications of Psychological Type in Gainesville, Florida, in the use and application of psychological types. And so that's how I got started, was because I knew she and I were butting heads. We were total opposites. I didn't know why, and I really was so frustrated by the end of that school year that I thought I would leave Radford. And as it turned out, once we discovered our natural differences and the reasons for those, we became to work more like this than we did like this, because we realized we each had gifts that were different, and that we could use those productively for the betterment of the student body if we recognize one another's gifts instead of constantly being turned off by those differences.
That's fascinating. And I know that Myers-Briggs testing has had wide usage in the business world, on university campuses, probably in marriage counseling. I guess anywhere that human behavior comes into play, which is, of course, everywhere, the Myers-Briggs way of assessing human personality seems to be a very useful tool for understanding human behavior.
It is. Sometimes it's misused, Ozzie. Some people use it as sort of like a horoscope to try to explain to people why we're different, but then they don't go into the depths that are necessary for people to really make it an operational part of their lifestyle. Mm-hmm. It takes some time to introduce it in a way that people understand it and can incorporate it into understanding the gifts of themselves and others. But when it's used properly, it's a powerful tool. And it's based on hard science and data, with hundreds and hundreds of doctoral dissertations done using the Myers-Briggs as the research instrument in various settings and disciplines.
So here's $1 million question, Dave. Do you think that Myers-Briggs personality typing can help us to understand religious behavior?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, Ozzie, and really probably the best source for recognizing that people have different gifts comes actually from the Bible. And there's 3 passages that I would cite for your viewers that they might want to check. One would be Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27, where it says, God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. And then in Psalm 139, Psalm 139 says, God gave you everything you need, the truly right gifts chosen just for you. And in Romans chapter 8, verse 4, says, Paul writing to the Romans says, just as each of us has one body with many members, these members do not all have the same function. So in Christ, we who are many form one body. We have differing gifts according to the grace given us. So there's actually biblical basis for this. The more complete theory about how it works in the human psyche was developed by Carl Jung in his book that he published in 1921 called Psychological Types. And then along came Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs, a brilliant mother-daughter team in the 1940s who took Jung's theories and created a questionnaire that they felt like would identify people's preferences so that it could be used in business and relationships and spiritual guidance and all forms of human interaction.
Yeah. So I want to come back to Jung in a bit, but first I want just to comment on your biblical citations. What I got from those 3 passages is that we all share common humanity, but we have individual strengths, differences, and interests. And maybe we need to kind of focus on how we can best, realize our individuality, I suppose. So let me ask you this. I know one of the famous types within this Myers-Briggs testing theory is the difference between extroversion and introversion. And that's probably something most people are familiar with. Could you maybe just give me a couple of examples of how an extrovert versus an introvert may respond to worship or to experiencing God in different ways?
Yeah, Ozzie, I'd be glad to. And I might point out that Carl Jung, who came up with this model of human behavior, actually coined the terms introversion and extroversion from the Latin root words. And introversion means inward turning, and extroversion means outward turning. And it basically describes the polar opposite ways that human beings get their energy that they need to operate in the world. With extroverts energizing by association with others, lots of contacts, talking with people, being in an active role in some capacity. And for introverts, that energizing behaviors tend to turn inward to thought and reflection, reading, contemplation, meditation, those kind of things. So what energizes one person may actually drain the energy from the other. I'm sure you know a lot of your extroverted students dread long reading assignments.
Oh, that's right.
Your introverted students may in fact dread having to make a class presentation because each one is pulling from their opposite, that at the age of most college kids, they're just not totally developed yet to be able to easily use either of those particular attitudes.
So I would take it then that say a person who's religious and extroverted might experience God quite nicely in a communal setting where there's a lot of interaction, where there are a lot of people around. Whereas someone who is religiously oriented but introverted might not fare so well in such a setting and might actually prefer a prayer closet or a meditation retreat. Am I gleaning from what you're saying there correctly? Would that be, I know, a very general but correct assessment?
Yes, I think you've nailed it. One of the interesting things in thinking about the difference between extroverts and introverts is if you don't know what an extrovert's thinking, you haven't been listening. If you don't know what an introvert's thinking, you haven't asked.
Yeah. So introverts are very guarded and very inwardly focused.
Typically, yes. And of course, everybody's different. No two introverts are just alike, just as no two extroverts are just alike, because everyone has different life experiences. And there are other things that influence our personalities besides our psychological type preferences. But they are a powerful indicator of the pathways that most of us find to God, can be identified by understanding one's four-letter type.
Well, it strikes me that information like this would be quite useful for leaders of religious communities so that they would provide different types of opportunities for different types of people to connect with the divine.
I think one of the classic mistakes that organized religion has made, at least in my view, Ozzie, is that we assume that one size fits all and that everyone should come to or should find the road on their spiritual path to be just like everyone else's. And if you understand personality type theory, that's just the furthest thing from the truth. And it's a big reason why I think so many people are turned off to organized religion. It tends to appeal to 3 or 4 of the 16 psychological types, but doesn't necessarily have much appeal for the others. It doesn't mean God isn't important to the others. It's just organized religion hasn't found how to bring them into the fold in ways that stimulate them and motivate them.
That's very interesting. Now, you mentioned in Myers-Briggs typing, there are 4 sets of letters. We talked about E and I, extroversion and introversion. Maybe take another pairing as an example and just maybe talk a little bit about how that another pairing would provide us insight into how people experience God or the divine.
Well, one of the subconscious mental functions of our personalities is how we perceive things, how we take in information. And Jung described that in 2 opposite ways. One was sensing, or in Jungian terms, he used the term sensation, and the other was intuition. And in Myers-Briggs terms, we use an N for intuition because we've already used the I for introversion. So for sensing types, the S types, they tend to experience God through the concrete, the predictable, the observable. They value tradition. They value consistency. They don't like surprises. They like things done in a way that they're comfortable with because they're very detail-oriented, factual, observant people naturally as sensing types. For intuitive types, they experience God through paradox and mystery and their imaginations. I know in our Sunday school class, you're getting ready to lead us into a discussion on the mystics. And my assumption going into that is that the vast majority of the mystics in history would have been intuitive types, likely introverted intuitive types, as just one example, where you find missionaries willing to go and give of themselves regularly to their flock in another country might be more likely to be extroverted sensing types because they want to put their faith into action and bring their tradition to others. And so two different, completely different experiences brought about by the best spiritual path for each of those types. So intuitives value possibilities and look for the unexpected, and they're comfortable with ambiguity, and they like to search for answers, where sensing types prefer to be given the answers and then find ways to apply them in everyday real applications.
That's fascinating. Just hearing you talk, it occurs to me that probably most organized religion, I guess, speaks more directly to sensing types, and in most cases would probably prefer intuitive types to stay on the periphery or in the background. I think you're exactly right about most mystics falling into that intuitive category. And I think that's one of the reasons they have always been sort of on the periphery of mainstream religious traditions.
That would make sense. And the administrative hierarchies of most churches, like the Methodist Church or the Catholic Church or the Episcopal Church, likely include a lot of sensing types because they're the ones that value tradition and bring order to situations, and that's one of the roles of those kind of administrative posts.
So when we look at, for example, the history of Christianity and the development of orthodoxy, that's kind of a sensing product there, whereas the intuitive types would be more experiential in their approach. And I bet too, we can't go into this now, but I bet a lot of the heretics in the history of Christianity were intuitive types as well, exploring for different possibilities and different ways of seeing things.
I wouldn't be surprised, and they head-butted with their opposites, who were the sensing types who valued structure and order and just couldn't live with that kind of ambiguity that they were introducing into the discussion.
That's very interesting. I'd love to have time to talk about all 16 types with you, but I want to move on from Myers-Briggs specifically to talk a little bit about the underlying theory with Jungian psychology and Jungian philosophy, with Jung's work with, maybe you can comment in particular on two things, the universal unconscious and the archetypes that both come out of Jungian psychology.
Well, I have to confess, Ozzie, I don't consider myself to have a great deal of expertise in Jungian psychology. So for any of your listeners who are much more well-versed than I am, my apologies. But I'll tell you the things that I learned years ago in my training to use psychological type in a constructive way. We learned some background about Jung and where these theories came from. And in Jung's construct, which differed from Freud's, who was his mentor originally, Jung believed that our psyches are made up of three major parts. And one is the conscious mind, and that's where our ego lies. And the other is the unconscious part of our personal experience, those dreams and maybe past experiences that we've suppressed and tried to forget, or maybe genuinely have forgotten, but they still are there beneath the surface, and they still sometimes have sway over our attitudes and our behaviors. And the third component of our personalities came from what he called the collective unconscious. And that is where the archetypes lie. And the archetypes are universal in all humans throughout time. If one were more of a biblical scholar than I am, as you are, I'm sure you could see examples of different archetypes and different biblical characters across the ages that the Bible covered. And in Jesus, we probably see the completion of wholeness as a divine human, because he embodied everything from both awareness of his unconscious mind, but also had command of the archetypes that sometimes control our lives without us realizing they're there. But they show up in art and literature, music, in other ways that I'm sure you can think of, our fantasies, our dreams. Archetypes are present, but we're not always aware, or we're typically not aware that they're there. I'll give you an analogy. An archetype is to the human psyche pretty much like the architectural blueprints are to a building. Once the building's built and people enter and exit that building and use it regularly, they don't have any clue that there was ever a set of architectural blueprints that was used to build that building. But those blueprints are still there. That building wouldn't have been built without the detail instruction that those blueprints provided to the general contractor to teach them how to build the building. And our archetypes are God's presence in our lives in various forms. The God that we can't name, that who's too awesome and too complex for humans to even fully fathom, probably shows up in us in a variety of different ways unconsciously. And those are the gods or goddesses within us. And Carol Pearson did a landmark book many years ago, I'd say probably 20, called Awakening the Heroes Within. I don't know if you can see that, but
I can see that, yes.
It's a great work describing her take on Jung's archetypes. She actually identifies 12 different archetypes and defines them as gods and goddesses in our lives, meaning that they are each one a portion of the monotheistic God that we worship.
So we the archetypes that help to find who we are psychologically, to provide that kind of foundation for our personality and for our being. I guess we encounter them in our dreams and in our fantasies and inwardly, but also we find them in mythologies, stories, and art outwardly. Yeah. And people like Joseph Campbell and Carol Pearson have helped us to see this through mythologies. Now, you had mentioned finding archetypes in the Bible, and I was just thinking about it as you were talking about it. One of the best known archetypes, I guess, is the hero, and the hero's journey is a pattern that we find in mythology. So I'm thinking about biblical characters like David or Jonah, which seemed to me to fit that archetype quite well.
Right. And I think another aspect of archetypes is they teach us things without us always knowing it. But when you see profound changes in the path of one's life, like Saul, his transition to becoming Paul, would suggest to me that in his earlier life, when he was Saul and he was crucifying Christians, he was controlled by the shadow side of some of the archetypes. And at some transition point in his life, he began to be controlled more by the positive, gifted parts of those and other archetypes in his life. And what accounted for that change in that influence, I can't explain. It may be better known to biblical scholars, certainly, than it is to me. But if one accepts that archetypal beliefs are true, then that's very likely to be what results in sometimes profound life changes that people experience. And they often don't even know for sure why. They describe it maybe as a vision. An angel from heaven can help them convert. But in the process of that conversion, they began to accept and identify with the bright side of those archetypes rather than the shadow sides of those archetypes, which are dark and negative.
Right. Wow, this is all so fascinating, Dave. I feel like we've only scratched the surface. But what I've taken from this, unfortunately, we're out of time, but what I've taken from this is that there's so much about human personality that we may not fully understand, but it certainly seems that having a greater understanding of personality helps us to better understand all aspects of who we are, including the spiritual and the religious. Is that right?
I absolutely would agree with that.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you being willing to meet with me in this somewhat awkward format, but it's a great way that we can continue our programming here at App TV. So thank you again, Dave, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ozzie. It was a pleasure.
All right. Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us again next week as we continue to explore the many ways that religion affects our society and our culture. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.